A very good morning to all of you. We've been dealing with an essay by Dipesh Chakraborty, which was published in EPW, that is the Economic and Political Weekly, one of the prestigious weekly published from India. And we are referring to an essay, Subaltern Studies in Retrospect and Reminiscence by Dipesh Chakraborty. We have already come to know about the background of this particular essay through a preparatory note given by Dipesh Chakraborty himself. Then he takes us into their history, how certain studies developed, and he categorizes the term subordinate studies in two ways. He keeps one of the terms in quotation marks, and the other one is used in italics. So the italics refers to the beginning of subordinate studies, whereas he's referring to the study from the beginning itself, whereas quotation marks suggest uh, present scenario. So this quotation mark refers to an ongoing field of studies, not dead or extinct by any means, and these italics refer to the series of publications initiated by Ranjit Guha. Now their series is closed. Okay. So he looks back into the history of the development and he refers to the generative errors and he refers to these errors under two sub-themes. One is that of what we call the archaic in the modern, and the other one is the subject of history. And we have already talked about the archaic in the modern, and the way he illustrates by giving different examples from Indian scenario, and then he refers to a way of looking at the things, seeing a different world, how structuralism gave them the perception of looking at the things. And he started using the knowledge of structuralism and understanding this particular subaltern studies, we can say. Then the other thing that he refers to is the subject of history, and with reference to Gayatri Spivak and others, he tries to elaborate that there cannot be a single voice, no voice. A voice is no interpretations and all. Then we started talking about the agency of the crowd. You need to understand that the subject of Indian history is not an individual person or so. That is what he is trying to illustrate here, explain here. Then he refers to the agency of the crowd, which is a different perception. It does not continue with the Spivak's line of inquiry. He returns to the foundational moment of subaltern studies, and even he looks at Ranjit Guha's book, Elementary Aspects, for the way he posed the question of the subject of history. Then he compares it with that of E.P. Thompson, first of all, and he tries to establish the difference in their perception. So whether it was Edward Thompson or George Reed, analysis of writers means the people involved in creating riots or disorder, the crowd we can say, and crowds went in the direction of humanizing the crowd by looking for individual faces. Means they try to establish the individual contribution of individuals in the development of these kind of movements. So his historiography, there is no doubt that historiography in general has been enriched by the efforts of these deservedly famous European historians. He acknowledged their contribution in the development of historiography, but he thinks that Guha's structuralist answer was different from theirs. He differed from these Anglo historians, from Thompson and Reed. His perception, Ranjit Guha's perception was structuralist. It was significantly different from both the scholars that he mentions. So how is it different? He thinks, Dipesh Chakrabarti thinks that Ranjit Guha did not look to delineate faces in the crowd. Means he didn't want to represent any individual who represented the crowd. He did not look for the face of any individual who leaded that movement. But that method only dissolved the crowd into so many individuals. Means if once you start looking at individual faces, then the crowd will lose its importance. The crowd will dissolve into many individuals. Therefore, he prefers to uh, understand this particular agency of the crowd. Whereas the agency of the crowd means he calls the crowd as an agency. For example, the government is an agency. So the crowd itself becomes the agency here. And this agency of the crowd is affected and legitimized precisely by its facelessness. So what we understand is that there is a difference in their perception of looking at the crowd, means in the perception of the Anglo historians and Guhas. We can say Guha looks for the faceless crowd, whereas the names that we mentioned, Thompson and Rood, refer to, they try to see the face of the crowd. But according to the subaltern study scholars, the agency of the crowd is more powerful, is affected, and it becomes legitimate because of its facelessness. A crowd does not have any face. Okay, means what we say, the Gardira Chehra Nasto. And Ranjit Guha also believed in that. Now, how does all this relate to Indian democracy? He raises this question. How does this agency of crowd relate to Indian democracy? And then he takes survey of development of this agency of crowd, which is one of the important methods of democracy. One of the most interesting ways in which Indian democracy, he says, or some other emerging democracies, such as the South African one. So he refers to the first of all the Indian democracy, and then you might be knowing something called South Africa. South Africa got its independence from the British rule in 1992 or so under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. You might be knowing that. So we also struggled for our independence. So South African history can be equated to that of Indian history. So these are the emerging democracies, developing countries. So what he says, one of the most interesting ways in which Indian democracy has begun to diverge from Western liberal democracies is in their use of public disorder. So this is the difference between Indian democracy or the emerging democracies and Western liberal democracies. What is the difference? These emerging democracies like India, South Africa use public disorder as a means, as one of the means. However, he mentions, Chakrabarti mentioned that he's using this word into quotation marks, disorder, provisionally. He's using provisionally, therefore he's kept it in quotation marks. So what we understand is that another means he talks about the methods, the ways in which Indian democracy began to diverge from Western liberal democracies as part of political bargaining. The democracy came out of political bargaining within a constitutionally democratic structure. Recently, the opposition to the farm bill and the withdrawal of the farm bill is an instance of this particular crowd politics we can see. So you might be knowing that some leaders, farmer leaders, they were on the street for the period of more than 1 year. You might be knowing that. So eventually, the government of India has had to withdraw the farm bill, the three farm bills introduced. So this can be seen as a part of political bargaining within a constitutionally democratic structure. And he thinks that this is a feature that distinguishes Indian mainstream political parties from their counterparts in the West. This is the difference between the Western political parties and Indian political parties. Counterparts means you might be knowing is political parties in the other part. Counterpart does not mean political parties. I mean to say just like similar. Means as we have political parties in India, there in other countries as well there are political parties. They are called counterparts. Same in the case of students. For example, you are Indian students and you have your counterparts in other countries. That is the word. You should understand that. Okay. Teachers in India and their counterparts in Western countries. This is how the term is used. So when we understand the Indian political system, these political parties, they try to function on the basis of this crowd politics, we can say. So that is the feature that distinguishes Indian mainstream political parties like Congress, BJP, etc., from their counterparts in the West. A successful Indian political party has to have the capacity to create mayhem on the streets as a way of publicizing and pushing their demands. Which parties can become successful? The parties which can manage to bring crowd on the road, on streets, for their demands. Even political movements fighting for rights of particular castes. You have seen it during the Fadnavis government. Many Maratha organizations came on the road demanding reservation and all. You have witnessed it. I'm giving the examples. So political movements fighting for the rights of particular castes. So that was the case of Marathas in Maharashtra. Earlier to that, you might be knowing the Meena community in Rajasthan or the Jats in Haryana and Rajasthan. Is the way you just remember these. Therefore, I'm giving the example of the movement of Maratha leaders on the road for the reservation. But earlier than that, the Meena community in Rajasthan had also gone for such kind of what we call agitation on the roads. Even the Patidar community in Gujarat, Patels, Patidars, and Jat communities, you might be knowing. So all these communities have been demanding for the reservations all these days, although they belong to the upper class, we can say upper caste groups. Their, their demands haven't been fulfilled yet. So the political movements fighting for rights of particular castes, those of peasants against like musician, will try to acquire at least a capacity for public violence or disorder as a way of advancing their cause. Same thing happened in case of the farm movements in India recently. So they wanted the government to withdraw, to take back the farm bills. So they have experienced it. So it's referring to such kind of crowd politics. Then these righteous crowds are an old established pre-colonial feature of Indian politics. Politics. Rioters mean the crowds involved in creating disorder. Fasad, hangama, okay, danga fasad we call. There is the rights crowd. And this is not a recent phenomenon. You should not think that it is happening only recently. The media creates such a picture. Makes us think that such things are happening after 2014 only. That wasn't the case. So you can see the reference here. A reference, and this essay was published in the year 2013 before Modi came into power. So writers' crowds are an old, established pre-colonial feature of Indian police. The words we use in Hindi or Bengali to describe crowd is crowd violence is fasad, hangama, golmaal, and are all figures of disorder. And this was very common for the Mughals. It is equal to the crowd politics that went on in the Mughal reign. And this happened, Fasad, Hangama, Golmaal was a kind of disorder for the Mughals and even the British rulers after them. And they did treat crowd action only as a problem of order. Looked at this as a problem of order, not as a political problem. Okay, but Dipesh Chakraborty thinks that some kind of historical research is required to connect the evolution of bazaars. Today we say bazaar. Many times, you must have heard people saying "Khai khai bazaar mandlai." So the evolution of bazaars to crowd action would probably pay some rich evidence in South Asian history. He says. He thinks that there should be some kind of research on the evolution of bazaars, how bazaars came into being, to understand this crowd action. Hence, trade and the move towards urbanization started from bazaars itself. Now, the establishments started taking place at the place of bazaars, crowded places. Okay, for example, the cities like Mumbai and Pune, etc., or district places were bazaar places earlier, and gradually they became the trade centers, and the movement of crowd started taking place, and that is how urbanization took place. And if a research is conducted in the direction, then it will be helpful to understand South Asian history. That's what he thinks. The emergence of the crowd, mainstream political actor, as I mentioned earlier, begins, of course, under Gandhi. So, what we think is that these kind of things are taking place only recently, but it started under the leadership of Gandhi, and some kind of foreshadowing of it had taken place in the 1910s as well, before Gandhi came on this political scenario under the leadership of Lokmanya Tilak and all. Such things were happening. There was kind of foreshadowing, Swarajya movement and all. But Gandhi was the leader who mobilized the crowd. Of course, he was always formally and morally opposed to the violence that ensued from this. He did not support the violence that came that caused because of the coming together of people. He morally opposed it, the violence, and formally as well opposed such kind of violence. But do you know, after independence as well, these were the scenario. So out of kind of anger, even Jawaharlal Nehru, the prime minister, and the constitutionalist Dalit leader, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, often reminded the nation, the people of the country, that even the Gandhi method of satyagraha was only suited for fighting the British and should not be deployed against the national government. They thought so in the early years of independence. Both of them were having this opinion, but that appeal was in vain. The people did not take it seriously. They continued coming on the streets, demanding their rights. So today, one cannot write of crowd action or more broadly violent politics of the street as simply the disorder of Indian democracy. When you go back to the history of this crowd, and that is the part and parcel of Indian democracy. We cannot simply describe it as a disorder, a violence. It is an integral part of how democratic politics are understood and practiced in India. Democratic politics is understood and practiced in India in terms of the crowd that the political party gathers and a new kind of political subject emerges in India. This political subject is demotic. Demotic means using abusive language. For example, you heard the people slogans and all. That is demotic. Means कोण म्हणते देत नाही घेतल्याशिवाय राहत नाही something of this kind, and democratic as well, because it now belongs to the multiple meanings the word democracy has come to have in India. In Indian democracy, it is equated. Means when we define democracy, of the people, by the people, etc., we give the popular definition of the people, for the people, by the people. Okay, there is a parody as well of for double F of, instead of for they say for the people, and by, instead of by, the satirists use by the people. So that is one of the ironical definition. But when we talk about democracy, we think of crowd only in India. The peasant insurgencies that he's referring to, Goha is referring to in his book, were the forerunner of this political subject. They were the beginners. I mentioned earlier that many insurgencies took place. We refer to the uprising of or insurgency of 1857. Prior to that as well, means many of the tribal communities, had come together to fight against Britishers. So these were the forerunner of this kind of political subject and the modes of mobilization. And these kind of things are still visible in many of the riots and insurgencies in India. Okay. Even today, whatever happens in India politically happens in this manner only. So Guha's hunch is not something which is based on thoughts, rationality, which is based on emotions or intuition, we can say. It is not based on logical operations. So he says Goa's hunch that peasants, means it is not proven actually. He thinks, he feels. It is his intuition that peasants of colonial societies were not pre-political. As Hobsbawm was the British historian, is referring to. Means in Britain, they took peasants' movements as pre-political. I mean, they weren't connected with politics before the politics started. Politics means before the statehood started. Had imagined they captured something with the spirit of these times. Okay, they were not pre-political according to Guha. But we did not know very clearly what political meant in this context. So, what is political? Then again keeps it into quotation marks. Goha's answer that these peasant movements could form the basis of a sustained move towards radical social transformation in India has proven wrong. Peasant movements could form the basis of sustained move towards radical social transformation has proven wrong. And this is the error. The error was in Deepak Chakravarti's view, generative. Generative in a sense, I told you, infinite. There is no end to it. One day, scholars will return to elementary aspect, not to read the book on Guha's terms, but find in it a way, a method of constructing a genealogy of the mass political subject in India, he says. I mean, today we read Guhas, but someday scholars will reread this book, not for the sake of information, but to understand a way, a method of constructing a genealogy. Genealogy means tracing the origin, where it starts from. Vamshavali in Marathi we call it. So genealogy of the mass political subject in India. Where did it begin? For example, you go for the family genealogy. Okay. So to see that, the people will read, the scholars will read elementary aspects. This would not be the only genealogy. The very logic of genealogies is multiple. Genealogy is not there isn't a single genealogy as such. It is multiple. But that would be one important way of figuring out how the history of subaltern rebellion has left its imprint on contemporary India. So this book, I mean the history which talks about the subaltern rebellion, has left its imprint, as its impact on contemporary India. Okay, so after discussing all these things about what we call the agency of the crowd, and how its role in establishing democracy in India, he talks about how this particular subaltern rebellion has its impact on contemporary India, because it still continues. There are many of the movements. It was a kind of pigeon movement only, farmer movement that recently took place. Of course, there are different opinions about that movement. Some thought that it was funded by Khalistanis, and some others who were in favor of, they thought that it is the one who gives us bread and butter has come on the road. So there were mixed kind of opinions. In the next part of my lecture, I shall be talking about the postscript. He begins with a preparatory note and he ends with a postscript.